Hello wonderful person, this is Anton, and in this video we're going to discuss the mysterious Tabby star once again. The star that's sometimes also referred to as WTF star, which is a somewhat funny reference to the original discovery, where WTF actually stands for Where's the Flux? Or basically, why is the star so dim? Although technically the official name here is KIC 8462852. And while since its original discovery back in 2015 by Tabetha Boyajian, this particular star has baffled astronomers with its somewhat unusual non-periodic dimming events. In this case, events that seem to dim the star by up to 22%, implying something really massive, and something that we actually have not seen before prior to this discovery. And for many years, astronomers have been physically trying to figure out what's causing this and what's actually going on, because by itself, this was just a little bit strange. And naturally, at some point, someone had to propose the extraterrestrial intelligence as a potential explanation. And so one of the main reasons the star is so famous is because, at some point, there was a hypothesis that maybe this is a result of some kind of a Dyson sphere, with additional explanations suggesting some kind of a destroyed planet or a swarm of massive comets. But over the years, scientists have also discovered a lot of additional things about these types of stars, with some of the conclusions previously discussed in the videos you can find in the description. But based on this recent study from 2026, we might have our final missing piece of the puzzle that might explain everything all at once. There seems to be a giant partner orbiting the star, something that was now explored in this study by Christina Maidurga-Favieres, mostly based on the analysis from the NASA's TESS mission, alongside ground-based radial velocity calculations in order to discover the mass of the object. And here this is actually a really important observation because while the TESS telescope mostly showed us somewhat erratic asymmetric dips that were kind of difficult to explain and did not make a lot of sense at first, which is why a lot of scientists started to think it's Dyson spheres or massive comets, this recent data reveals something entirely different and something that was kind of previously difficult to establish. A single, symmetric, round-shaped transit that's extremely similar to the event we've seen so many times. But to understand why this is a big deal and what this tells us about these objects, let's discuss exactly what was discovered and how it was found, and also discuss other similar stars where very similar dimming events have also been found. But first, let's discuss the transit. This is obviously something that happens when an object passes directly between us and the host star. And well, for this star, a lot of these dimming events were just somewhat strange. They basically had slightly different shapes every single time, but more importantly, most of them did not seem to repeat. And it was really this strange, erratic behavior that started this multi-year mystery. But this new event, discovered by TESS, seems to have lasted 21 hours and was actually perfectly symmetrical, definitively showing us that whatever this was, it was caused by a spherical object, and an object that was solid and relatively large in size. But now, by combining this transit with the radial velocity data, which allowed the scientists to measure the wobble of the star due to gravity, researchers could now also estimate its mass, and it was discovered to be approximately 9.4 times the mass of Jupiter, which makes this object pretty massive, and its overall size seems to be larger than Jupiter as well, approximately 1.7 times larger, which basically implies that this is a giant partner, and actually a partner that's somewhat interesting to science. With 9.4 masses of Jupiter and 1.7 radii of Jupiter, it actually makes the nature of this object a little bit difficult to determine, because it could be a giant planet, but it can also be a brown dwarf. And normally in astronomy, a brown dwarf is an object with at least 13 masses of Jupiter. There are some examples where it's actually much lower. And so here it's heavy enough and massive enough to possibly start fusing deuterium, but not fuse hydrogen yet. In other words, this is unlikely to be a planetary object, and instead seems to be a kind of a hybrid. But this exact boundary and the exact definition is still debated. Although at least based on its density, at 2.2 grams per centimeter cube, it does seem to resemble a massive gas giant a little bit more than a typical brown dwarf. Normally they're smaller in size, and their density is a little bit higher. But the reason this discovery is so crucial is actually because it potentially explains these dips. And well, for a long time, the leading explanation for Tabby star was basically a family of disintegrating exocomets, or these really massive planetesimal fragments, very similar to smaller dwarf planets we've discovered on the outskirts of the solar system, but in this case fragments that are potentially falling apart. And here there was always this question: why would so many comets suddenly dive toward the star all at once? Or in other words, why would they suddenly change their orbits and basically block the starlight by so much? And more importantly, do so only once, in essence causing these bizarre dips. And well, officially, the discovery of this giant planet, or this tiny brown dwarf, provides the engine to this bizarre mystery. Here, this giant object, orbiting with a period of 3.3 years or 1211 days, would actually exert a very strong gravitational pull and would constantly perturb very small icy bodies on the outskirts, so basically different planetesimals and different comets, kicking them from their stable orbits and essentially sending them on a collision course with the inner star system. And naturally, as a lot of these comets get closer and closer to the star, because of the heat from the star, they would break apart, creating these massive, jagged, dusty clouds that would spread across the inner star system and would essentially cause these dips, dimming the star by up to 22%, with this massive dip that made the star so famous very likely being a large amount of these comets, or maybe just a very massive comet, creating the largest such dip. And by itself, this is a huge win for the ideas in astronomy referred to as orbital dynamics, because here it definitively shows us that a star's erratic behavior is not necessarily a sign of something impossible, and is usually the result of a much more complex multi-body system where something large and something massive like a planet is just causing a lot of chaos among much smaller objects, with another implication in this case being the discovery of dust. And that's because researchers noticed a slight brightening in the data provided by TESS just before and after the giant's transit in front of the star, which could be the result of a phenomenon known as forward scattering. Here, the light from the star hits dust particles surrounding the companion and is then redirected toward planet Earth, which also suggests that the companion itself might have its own ring system or some kind of a debris disk, very similar to a giant version of Saturn. In other words, here scientists potentially also discovered a ring system around this planetary object. Not a very large one, but still quite impressive. Which means that after just under 1 decade, this bizarre star and its unusual mystery may have been officially solved. Because here this does explain quite a lot all at once. But for astronomical studies, this is also important because this is not the only such star with these very strange dimming events. As a matter of fact, as we discussed in previous videos, for a few years now, quite a few cousins have also been discovered with very similar strange behavior. One of the most famous examples is VV WIT07, where WIT stands for "What is this?" And here this star showed dimmings of up to 80%, and just like the Tabby star, it did not seem to have any pattern, leading astronomers to believe that this is another system with very similar cometary and dust dimming events, which we now understand might also be the result of a very massive partner in its orbit. Likewise, in a different star system we've discussed previously, referred to as Assassin 24FW, here there was a massive dimming event lasting up to 9 months and blocking the light by up to 97% at some point, with this F-type star being super strange and once again surprising everyone. But astronomers are now pretty certain that this was the result of a massive circumplanetary disk, or basically a giant planetary disk, around one of these hidden planets, very similar to Tabby's star once again. And intriguingly, once again, it's implied to be a brown dwarf-like object, but in this case containing a massive disk, very likely creating its own planetary objects, or I guess its own moons. And interestingly, extremely recently, we've discussed the official confirmation of the first ever exomoon, which turned out to be an object orbiting one of these brown dwarfs, which was orbiting a star. Which essentially suggests that these types of systems might potentially be pretty common, or at least not as uncommon as we thought. With the last object referred to as EPIC 2497, also known as the Random Dipper, basically showing us a lot of separate dips that seem to be extremely unpredictable and very random. And at this point, this event still does not have a very specific explanation, but it's quite likely something very similar, which essentially suggests that these stars seem to all possess this Tabby phenomenon, which involves an extremely specific planetary configuration and a very specific evolution of stars where one of the objects basically becomes a brown dwarf. And all of this circumstellar dust and all of these planetesimal leftovers then end up creating incredibly complex visual effects that we're only now beginning to decode. But it only took 10 years to finally have this really solid explanation that does not involve aliens. Although here, when it comes to the Tabby star, there is still maybe one small mystery, or I guess one of the most persistent strange facts. This is in regards to its long-term fading, and that's because the archival data from over 100 years ago suggested that the star has been actually gradually dimming for at least a century. And while some scientists suggested that maybe this was just the result of very old photographic plates basically becoming damaged, the new data from TESS and Kepler does confirm that the star seems to fade by approximately 0.3% every single year. And, well, right now, there is no good guess why. It doesn't seem to be caused by a single object, but might be caused by some kind of a large-scale dust structure that's slowly moving in front of the star from our perspective. Maybe the result of the destroyed moon or a planet, or a huge planetesimal that was basically dislodged by this companion. And when we look at these dips through different filters, it does become obvious that the blue light is blocked more than the red light, which essentially confirms that it's most likely made out of fine dust. The same type of dust we find in the solar system that actually causes a phenomenon referred to as the zodiacal light. Essentially something that looks like this. Although in this case, in our solar system, most of this seems to be the result of dust from Mars, even though some of it does come from comets. And so this very strange dust phenomenon visible from Earth is actually formed by the Martian surface losing a lot of dust as a result of constant storms. But in terms of the actual appearance, it seems to be very similar to what we see in the Tabby star. And so I guess what's the conclusion and what have we learned so far? Well, based on this recent 2026 study, we're now pretty certain that there is a partner orbiting every 1211 days. But in this case, because it was only observed once, we do need a confirmation, which we should be able to see when it passes in front of a star again in the next few years. And here scientists identified 5 potential windows for future transits based on the gaps in the old Kepler data, with the most probable transit predicted for late 2026, early 2027. Which means that in the next few months, we might potentially have our final conclusion, with astronomers now hoping that the additional data from the Gaia telescope also providing precision astrometry in order to tell us exactly how the companion is pulling on the star, thus providing us with its official mass. But in the end, these discoveries from the Tabby star remind us how unusual the universe is and how a lot of star systems in the Milky Way seem to be much stranger than we imagined. While also reminding us that sometimes when things appear to be aliens, they're usually not. There's always a natural explanation that, though unusual, does eventually make sense. And in this case, it's basically a giant companion that seems to gravitationally bully the whole star system, creating a spectacular cosmic show that's visible to us on Earth from almost 1500 light years away. But I guess until we learn something else or until there are some additional discoveries, that's all I wanted to mention. Check out previous videos on the topic in the description. Thank you for watching, subscribe, come back tomorrow to learn something else, support the channel on Patreon where you can find additional videos without any ads and can DM it directly, or by joining the channel membership that grants you early access. You can also support this channel by buying the Wonderful Person t-shirt in the description below. Stay wonderful, I'll see you tomorrow, and as always, bye bye.